Welcome, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Goldstein, the president of the Municipal Art Society. Thank you for joining us for this virtual talk on historian Jeff Richman's new book, Building the Brooklyn Bridge, 1869 to 1883, an illustrated history with images in 3D. Tonight, we will explore the origins of this local and international architectural icon. In praise of the book, writer Kurt Anderson remarks, if you love Brooklyn or bridges or New York City or cities or 19th century marvels or all of the above, as I do, Building the Brooklyn Bridge is the perfect feast, a would-be time traveler's delight, overflowing with rare and evocative and fascinating images. It is a terrific book. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the man of the hour, Jeff Richman. Jeff has been fascinated by New York City history for as long as he can remember. In 2007, after 33 years practicing law, he became the full-time historian at Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery. Fueled by his love for history, Jeff has amassed a large collection of archival photographs of early New York, including many of the Brooklyn Bridge under construction. These remarkable images are featured in his book and in tonight's talk, many of which are in 3D. MAS sent out 3D glasses to all of you who registered by November 22nd deadline. So I really want you all to be sure you have them handy for your viewing pleasure, wherever you need to put them. Thank you for joining us, Jeff, and I will turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you to your staff who have done a wonderful job of arranging this and making sure that everything is going to work smoothly tonight, knock on wood. And so I'm particularly excited that we're doing this in 3D, and we will get to that shortly. I think we'll go to shared screen now. And here we go. So let me just get back up to the top here. Okay, so here we are, Building the Brooklyn Bridge, 1869 to 1883, an illustrated history with images in 3D by Jeffrey I. Richman. That is me. And so this book was really a labor of love. It came together in a way that I needed to do it and tell the story of the iconic Brooklyn Bridge. And so here we go. Here's the cover of the book. And to get us oriented, this is a Library of Congress image of the New York City in the late 19th century. And to our left, we see New Jersey and then the Hudson River, and moving to the right, Manhattan, tip of Manhattan, the Battery. And then we see the Brooklyn Bridge across the East River, connecting what was then the largest city in America, New York City, with the third largest city in America, Brooklyn. And so Brooklyn, of course, during the time of the construction of the bridge, 1869 to 1883, was a separate city from New York City. And if you look at the kind of far right, you see green in the distance to the east of developed Brooklyn. And that was a key to the Brooklyn Bridge, the idea being that Manhattan was fully occupied. In 1883, they did not have a sense that Manhattan was going to go up, that still cage construction was going to allow for expansion. And so the idea was to connect with Brooklyn where there was land available. And so the bridge quickly became the eighth wonder of the world. This is a token from 1889, just 6 years after the bridge was opened. And all sorts of commercial enterprises wanted to be associated with the bridge very quickly. This is a spool cotton company. And so you can see the cables up in here are spools in this illustration, and as the spools up in here also. And so the masterwork, certainly in terms of the Brooklyn Bridge, is David McCullough's The Great Bridge, which tells the story. But I had access to photographs and drawings and woodcuts that McCullough did not, and wanted to tell the story as an illustrated story. And so the story, the three dramatic individuals in this story are John A. Roebling, who was the father of Washington Roebling, and Washington Roebling's wife, Emily Roebling. And so we'll get to them shortly. So this, as we know, is the book. Here is the table of contents. And so I will track the sequence of construction as it appears in the book. I was very pleased to be able to get Richard Haw, who is the biographer of John Roebling, to write a piece at the beginning of the book, and then Erica Wagner, who wrote an essay, The Brooklyn Bridge, a Love Story, and she's the biographer of Washington Roebling. And so they were a tremendous help in putting this book together. And so we see engineers, workers, and then the various sequences, caissons, etc. So here are the chapters. The engineers, John Roebling and Washington Roebling, were the two chief engineers in sequence. And so John Roebling, the father, was trained in Germany as an engineer. He had studied philosophy. His family had lived in Mulhausen, Germany for centuries. But he decided as a fairly young man that Germany was not the land of opportunity, that everything had to be approved by a bureaucracy, that America was where he wanted to be. And so he fled Germany to become a farmer in Pennsylvania, established a town there with his brother, Saxonburg, in Western Pennsylvania, and farmed for about a year. And then he realized that he was bored with farming, that his mind was such that he was be much more interested in making things, and got into wire rope manufacture and then suspension bridge building, and became the leading suspension bridge builder in the world. And also the leading wire rope company in the world, primarily in Trenton, New Jersey. And Washington Roebling, his son, had graduated from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, had a degree in engineering. He was an experienced bridge builder. And so his idea of a summer vacation was to go build a bridge over the Niagara Gorge, or to build a bridge in Pittsburgh with his father. He was a Civil War veteran. He had enlisted as a private when his father kind of pushed him out the door and said it was time to go serve, and rose to a lieutenant colonel. Really had a remarkable record. Was at Little Round Top in Gettysburg, was a hero there. Became the chief engineer in waiting. His father had the name and the international reputation, but wanted Washington really to run the bridge building. And so he had done so in Cincinnati. He had been in charge of the cable spinning, and was only 32 years old when he took over the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. Emily Roebling, wife of Washington Roebling, daughter-in-law of John Roebling, played a key role in the construction of the bridge. She was not formally trained as an engineer, but she went to Europe with Washington to study the use of pneumatic caissons, and more on that shortly. And then when Washington became both physically and psychologically debilitated, just exhausted from the effort that he put into the early years of bridge construction, Emily became the liaison to the assistants and to the contractors. And so she would go out to the bridge 1, 2, 3 times a day. Washington Roebling, strangely enough, never set foot on the Brooklyn Bridge while it was being built, the 14 years of its construction. She was greatly admired by the staff, the first delegation of trustees to walk across the bridge as it was being built was led by Emily Roebling, and she was the first to ride across the bridge in a horse-drawn carriage, triumphantly holding a rooster aloft. So crossing the East River, why did we need a bridge, a Brooklyn bridge? Ferries had been running from Brooklyn to New York much earlier. So this is 1750, the Fulton Ferry running across, Brooklyn at the bottom, New York in the distance, the East River between them. East River, not really a river, but more of a tidal estuary, which made it all the more challenging to build a bridge across it. And even before Robert Fulton came along with a steam ship, they were running ferries across that were horse powered. And so these horses were the source of the power for the ferries. And there was a substantial problem with these ferries in that they were not reliable, particularly in winter, when the East River might freeze. And so here we see a newspaper article from this period, the 1860s, of the danger of people who needed to get to work from Brooklyn to New York or vice versa, and were climbing onto the ice, and then the ice started to break up. And so something more reliable was needed, and the solution was a suspension bridge. Let me see if I can, there we go. And so this is Scientific American, 1879, the Great Suspension Bridges of the United States. And so it shows 4 suspension bridges. The first one of which is a Roebling bridge. The second, third, and fourth are Roebling bridges. And so the Roeblings really stood apart from others. Competitors got contracts to build suspension bridges, and then unfortunately, those bridges tended to collapse. John Roebling's bridge, Washington Roebling's Brooklyn Bridge never collapsed. And so here we see the Niagara Bridge, built by the Roeblings, 1851 to 55, across the Niagara Gorge. It was a 2-tiered bridge. And so on the top, you had a railroad pulled by a steam locomotive. And on the bottom, you had a carriageway. So this was really unprecedented to be able to get the weight of a locomotive and its cars across a suspension bridge. And here we have a stereoscopic view, or a stereo view. And so this gives you an idea of the source of the 44 3D images that appear in the book. I have been a collector of stereo views for over 40 years now. I'm fascinated by them and the idea that with a little bit of technology, you can see images in 3D and travel the world. These were the home entertainment center of Victorian parlors, where you could go to Egypt or Paris or wherever. And so here we see the side-by-side, slightly different images, which when seen through a viewer, a hand viewer, you could see in 3D. And so now we go to the next step, which is an anaglyph. And so we are now in 3D land. And so many of you, I believe, have these 3D glasses. The red goes over your left eye, and the cyan or blue over your right eye. And you should be able to see this image in 3D. So this is generated by a computer program that a Japanese software genius put together to take the earlier image that we saw and morph it into this anaglyph or 3D image. And so here's another view of the same bridge in 3D. And so glasses appropriate once again. And here you see, you get a good view of the carriageway on the bottom of the bridge, and then the railway up above. In the distance, you see the American Falls here, and then the Canadian Falls over here of the Niagara. And here we are in Pittsburgh, Allegheny Bridge, 1857 to 59. You're starting to see the essential elements of a John Roebling suspension bridge. Towers, you see here, cables. So this is a bridge with 4 cables. The cables then have suspender wires drop down, and that is what supports the deck of the bridge. And also you've got to get enough height to allow for navigation on the waterway. And so here we are at the Cincinnati Covington Bridge, 1856 to 66. Construction interrupted by the Civil War. That's why it took 10 years to build this. And I think to many eyes, this looks like a mini version of the Brooklyn Bridge. Only 2 cables, a single arch as opposed to the Brooklyn Bridge with its double arch, certainly shorter in length than the Brooklyn Bridge, but the essentials are all here. And so the Brooklyn Bridge quickly became, it was known by several names, the Great East River Bridge, the New York and Brooklyn Bridge, et cetera, et cetera. Here's a Courier print of the bridge. And John Roebling, as early as 1857, was starting to draw plans for a bridge across the East River. This would have been across what is now Roosevelt Island, so close to where the 59th Street Bridge is now. And a view of the ferry, the Fulton Ferry on the Brooklyn side. This is the very distinctive mansard roof of the ferry terminal that opened during the Brooklyn Bridge construction. Here is the Brooklyn Tower of the Brooklyn Bridge, and you see these ferry slips. So these ferries were going back and forth all day, very busy, very crowded. And there was a problem. In June of 1869, John Roebling, Washington Roebling, and William Payne, one of the assistant engineers, were out at the Fulton Ferry landing and were measuring for the center line of the Brooklyn Bridge. And very similar here, this is actually a Hamilton ferry, another one of the ferries illustration. But you can see here these wooden piles, which the ferry would come into the slip. John Roebling was on this area and stood to the side thinking that he was safe out of the way, and it turned out he was not. And his leg was crushed and his toes were amputated. And within a couple of weeks, he died of lockjaw. He believed in water treatment for it. He was a very stubborn man by all accounts, and things did not go well. He fired one doctor after another and finally succumbed to lockjaw, a very, very painful death. And so the ferry killed him. This is his grave in Trenton. And Washington Roebling took over, stepped in as the chief engineer. Now, as I said, during the construction, during the work on the Caissons, the Caissons caught fire, and Washington Roebling went into the Caissons to help put those fires out. And there was compressed air in the Caissons, and he got the bends and suffered greatly from that, but also suffered from just what would have been termed in the 19th century nervous prostration. And so here he is in his home on Brooklyn Heights with a view of the Brooklyn Bridge. You see these binoculars. Historically, it was actually a telescope that he used to monitor the construction. And he even, with Emily, went to Trenton for 3 years in the midst of the construction and controlled the construction by letter, which is really quite amazing. And so I was able to pull together 253 images of the bridge being built Here's a wonderful photograph from the Museum of the City of New York of some of the staff and a close-up. And so you can see there's a key identifying many of the individuals in this photograph. And here's another great photograph of much of the staff, some of the trustees, Henry Cruz Murphy, who was kind of Mr. Brooklyn and got the legislation through the state legislature, authorizing the bridge company, some of the assistant engineers here. These are anchor bars and the strands of the cables. And here's a detail of that image showing the number 2 in command, C.C. Martin, who stayed on the bridge working as the chief engineer, taking over in July of 1883, right after the bridge had opened. He stayed there till 1902. E.F. Farrington, who was the master mechanic. William Payne, who had served with Washington Roebling during the Civil War. They had risked their lives changing out of their uniforms to go ride through Virginia, mapping what was going on and subjecting themselves, if they had been captured, to immediate execution as spies. And this is George McNulty, another of the assistant engineers in this top hat. McNulty was 21 years old when he applied to work on the bridge. He had just graduated from college. His application was rejected. He volunteered and then worked 14 years on the bridge as an employee. They were so impressed with his work. So 6 assistant engineers, one of whom was hired on a 30-day contract, and all of whom worked the entire 14 years of the bridge construction. So workers, there were thousands of workers, many of whom were Civil War veterans, many of whom had experience as sailors and were used to being high up in the air with little underneath you. Many immigrants from primarily Ireland and Germany. At any given time, there could be 500 or 1,000 workers working on the bridge. Early on in the caissons, tremendous turnover because it was wet work, it was muddy work, it was in compressed air, it was in heat and humidity. And so just to see the men who actually built the bridge. So now we're going back towards some of our 3D images. This is a wonderful images of construction on the bridge. You can see this tower has been completed here. Work is underway, and these barrels add a wonderful element. So this is a half stereo view, half of a stereo view. And this was clearly a photographer who understood 3D photography. And so, like anything else, there are people who know what they're doing and people who don't know what they're doing. And this photographer understood that in order to create a 3D image, you needed something in the foreground, something in the distance, and something in the midground. And so try this with your 3D glasses, and you should, if you rock back and forth, be able to see those barrels moving with you. And so a view of the approach of the bridge with all of this brickwork. The approach is the section of the bridge that allowed people, cable cars, horses, cows and pigs and sheep to get up onto the bridge at a gentle angle that they could handle. And so it ran from the land span, which was an elevated span hanging from the cables, down from the anchorage to ground level. And so again, a half stereo, and then in 3D with your glasses, you can see these people working on the brickwork. And you also see at far right that number 6, the steam engine that they were using. So the caissons were the very foundation of the bridge. They were huge wooden boxes. Washington Roebling and Emily Roebling had gone to Europe, which had pioneered the use of caissons for mining and for bridges. And the idea was that you were going to build this huge wooden box that was open at its bottom, and you were going to launch it. It was going to be built in a shipyard along the East River. It was going to be launched like a ship, and it was made out of timber. So kind of very primitive technology box, 168 feet long, 102 feet wide. David McCullough calculated you could put 4 tennis courts up on the top there. You get some idea of its scale with all the people that are up on top. And this was how you were going to dig the foundation of the towers down into the ground. And so before you could dig, or you wanted to dig, you needed to know what you were going to come across. And so they took sample borings. And so this is the setup to take those borings. And this is from the Municipal Archives, one of the beautiful drawings that appears in my book. And oops. And this is a detail. So you can see this is annotated, the various levels at 32 feet. You're going to go get smaller boulders, and then sand and gravel, et cetera, et cetera. So this allowed them to plan as to what they were going to encounter. As I said, the caissons were launched like a ship. They were built in the Webb and Bell shipyard along the East River in Greenpoint. As the historian at Greenwood Cemetery, I'm familiar with this monument, which is atop our catacombs. And so you see a wonderful granite carving of a ship. Eckford Webb built some of the biggest, fastest ships on the seas. But his proudest accomplishment, his epitaph on the back of his monument, an eminent shipbuilder and constructor of the caissons for the first Brooklyn Suspension Bridge. And so that's, of course, what we know today as the Brooklyn Bridge. So here's the caissons, not to get overly technical, but as designed by Washington Roebling. Here is the workspace where the workers are digging this huge box into the ground, the largest thing ever dug into the ground in history up until that time. And then they're using wheelbarrows to bring the debris into pools. And then they're using these clamshell buckets that go through water to get there. So the water is designed to keep the compressed air in the workspace there. And the compressed air is designed to keep the water of the East River to the extent possible out of the workspace. And so there was a balance here, not too much water, the water would flood the caisson, too little water, and they would get what they called a blowout, where the water would just go shooting 500 feet up into the air. And then they had a lock for the workers to come in. They had a place for the compressed air to come in, and a supply shaft to allow them to drop bricks and cement down and make concrete to fill the caisson when they had reached the level they wanted to. And at the same time, they're building the towers on top of these caissons. So these caissons, understand, are still underneath the towers of the Brooklyn Bridge and will remain there forever and ever. So here is John Roebling's early plan for the caisson, which had the fundamentals, but did not have several of the shafts that Washington Roebling added to make the caisson that much more accessible and useful. And you can see the tower itself being built up above the caisson. So they're actually stacking one stone at a time, one stone block at a time. And here we see the more refined version by Washington Roebling of the various shafts that they needed to make the construction as easy as possible. So here is a wonderful photograph. You can see here we're on the New York side. So the tower on the New York side is being built right in here atop the Caisson. And you can even see the Brooklyn Tower in the distance. So here's the Fulton Ferry landing. Brooklyn Tower was more advanced, had been started earlier than the New York Tower. And you see snow on the ground here. So one might suspect this is winter. And then you see barges with the granite that was going to be used for the towers. And you see these smokestacks here. And what are those about? And so those we know are about, here's a close-up, air compressor house. So these are the pumps, engines that are being used to compress the air and create this compressed air environment where the workers were working. And you see also winter is written here, which makes sense given the snow that we just saw. And Erica Wagner, Washington Roebling's biographers, as I said, is an expert on all things Washington Roebling. And she tells me that this is in fact Washington Roebling's handwriting here, that he's the one who wrote this. So here's an airlock, woodcuts. Richard Hall has an incredible collection of woodcuts of the Brooklyn Bridge, and he generously shared those with me. And here we are breaking up boulders. And so they would come across boulders, all sorts of debris that the glacier had left, you know, boulders from Connecticut and up in the Hudson Valley. And they had to break these apart to get them out of the caisson. And so they were originally doing this manually, just with hammers and iron rods. And then Washington Roebling had the idea of blasting. And so he experimented with a revolver with increasingly large black powder charges and discovered that it did not create a problem, that no one was damaged, no one was harmed, and work could proceed. And so that's what they were doing. They were blowing these things up down there. And so the debris, trucking it over to the pools. Here's the water shaft and pool. So this is at the bottom. This shaft, this pool is about 6 feet deep. They soon discovered that these pools tended to harden with the debris in it, and the clam shells couldn't get the material out. Excuse me. And so they assigned these men with these rods to mix. And then also you see at the bottom here, they're sending more water into the pool to keep it as liquid as possible. And so just some of the drawings, just graphically, are, I think, sensational. This is a drawing by John Roebling of the dredgers as he planned them in 1867, 2 years before the bridge construction would begin. And then here is what the construction actually looked like atop the caisson. So this is one of the clam shells. And here's the other one. They put, Washington Roebling did all sorts of experiments. He put steel teeth on these clam shells. And this fellow is of interest. I did have a consultant, a experienced engineer familiar with historic construction. And he explained to me that this fellow seated up above the clamshell is in fact signaling to the operator of the steam engine that controlled the height of the clamshell. And so this was just going up and down. And when it got into the down position, this fellow's job was to wave to the steam engine operator to tell him that he had reached the depth that he needed to be at and to stop lowering it. So here's a photograph from a lantern slide showing the clamshell emptying its debris that it has pulled out from inside the caisson into a car. And then these cars were dumped in, the debris was dumped into the East River, and then they dredged the material out. So a wonderful cabinet card. Again, we're looking from New York across towards Brooklyn, and we can tell with the ferry terminal over here and with the fact that the Brooklyn Tower is higher than the New York Tower. And so great drawing by John Roebling. And you can see there's a little detail in here. And the detail is this with a woman with a parasol for no apparent reason other than to kind of have a good time drawing this. And so to go back for a second, these I think are key to the iconic status of the Brooklyn Bridge. A grand entrance, certainly something that John Roebling had seen in Germany, where he grew up in this walled community. And so the solidity of this, the idea of a grand entrance, the idea that it was important what you were doing, that you were leaving Brooklyn to go to New York or leaving New York to go to Brooklyn, I think is key to the Brooklyn Bridge's appeal. Nothing like this was ever done again. So Washington Roebling planning the towers of the bridge, and you can see that there were these empty hollow spaces here and here and here. The towers of the bridge are not solid. They are granite and they are not going anywhere, but in order to save on construction costs, he designed them with these hollow spaces. So some other wonderful photographs, Tower Rising. You see here these granite blocks that the photographer, I think this photographer had an in with the bridge company, was able to get them to position those blocks to make the photograph that much more dramatic, was able to get the workers to pause in their work, which I'm sure was no easy thing, and even to get some of the suits to pause and look at the camera. So now we're looking at the New York Tower and New York skyline. You see Harper's Weekly, Harper's Publishing, the largest publishers in the world. You see St. Paul's Chapel. You see the old Tribune building that was on Park Row, and you get a sense of how massive the Brooklyn Bridge towers were as compared to the buildings both in New York and in Brooklyn. And so here again, just a wonderful image in 3D. Try that with your glasses of a sailing boat coming across with New York in the background. And another wonderfully composed photograph of the tower of the bridge with these barrels in the foreground. And here's another one in 3D for you, just beautifully done by the photographer, with the derrick in the foreground, the wall of the Brooklyn Tower to the left, and the New York Tower in the distance. Looking down from the Brooklyn Tower at Brooklyn, so Brooklyn even more diminutive than New York. And then the anchorages. So the cables that were the key to this suspension bridge had to be anchored, had to be tied down at their ends so that they could support the massive weight of the bridge. And so they built these granite constructions, also hollow. In 1983 for the centennial, I remember going into the Brooklyn side anchorages. It's a big open space. John Roebling touted it as a potential vault for the storage of money and gold, but its function for the bridge was to hold the ends of the cables. And so here you see what these anchorages were doing. You have an anchor plate, a massive iron kind of spidery thing going on. And then you have these that are built up one level at a time and then surrounded by stone. And then they connect to the cables of the bridge. And so here you see the relative position of the anchorages. The anchorages are still there. They're underneath the deck. And so not many people notice them. Here are the kind of starfish effect of the anchor plates to which each of the strands of the four cables would be attached. And so here we are in 3D. You see there are two workers there, I believe surveying, and then you see the anchor plates of the bridge. And then the anchor bars as they came up through the anchorage, and here we are in 3D with those bars. So the footbridge and cables, this is the footbridge here that you see the men on. The footbridge was a temporary structure. It was not to be part of the bridge. It was to allow the worker access. And so you had these cradles on which men were stationed, and they were to signal as the wires were spun, whether the wires were sufficiently taut or too loose, and then to be adjusted. Here you see three of the cradles. There were two more on the outside. And this is, I think, the best of the 3D images in the book. And so again, a function of the skill of the photographer. We're looking from the top of the Brooklyn Tower across to the New York Tower. And again, if you rock yourself from side to side, you can see the supports of the footbridge moving with you. And you can even look down from the tower and get a sense of the footbridge as it dips between the towers. Here we have what would have been certainly of concern to OSHA, had OSHA existed back in the 1870s and 80s. And so this is the worker using one of the cradles, positioned on a cradle with this board kind of propped up there about 200 feet up in the air. And his job is to wave this flag if these cable wires are not doing their job, as they said. Each of the wires had to bear its weight. And so come one, come all. Little sign here, safe only for 25 men at one time, Washington Roebling. This was open to the public. You could climb up the steps that took you to the top of the anchorage. And then you see no security guard here, no fence even, no gate, just trot up these stairs and walk across the bridge. And as word spread that this was available to the public, they started to screen people. Here's another great 3D image. And so you see the anchor bars at bottom right, and then you see a carrier wheel here, which was part of the cable construction. The Brooklyn Historical Society, former Brooklyn Historical Society, has one of those that has survived. And you really get a sense of the depth here. And another one of looking down from the Brooklyn Tower, a worker with a goatee there. And then, oops. This shows you the public on the footbridge. Many people wanted to go across the footbridge. Some decided quickly that they had made a mistake. The slats of the footbridge were oak, but they were separated so as not to catch the wind. And so you were 150, 200 feet in the air. And if you look down through the slats, it could be problematic. One of the veteran workers said that the women who went up on the footbridge seemed to deal better with the situation than the men. And so now the cables. The cables were key to the construction. They were spun in place. You could not, these cables were 15 inches across. Each one of them had 19 strands. Each strand was about 300 wires. Each wire was the thickness of a lead pencil. And so This was thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of tons of steel wire. And that was one of the innovations of the bridge. This was the first bridge built with all steel. And you needed to spin the wires, pull the wires from Brooklyn to New York, and then by this carrier wheel, and then splice the wires, because the wires were only 800 feet long, yet there were 13,000 miles of wires that had to be used for the 4 cables. And here you see atop the Brooklyn Anchorage, the shed that held the wire. We're looking down. Here's the shed in Brooklyn. And here is a drawing that has the advantage of be able to see through the shed. 2 spools, each 8 feet in circumference, in diameter, excuse me, and 2 assigned to each cable. So here's the connection, a just astounding photograph of the anchor chain that was attached down to the anchorage, and the strands over to the right, these white wires. Washington Roebling experimented, used his mind. He was fully capable of calculating in his brain as the construction continued. Here he is experimenting with the layout of the strands. And so strand number 1 at the bottom, then 2 and 3. And you can see at the top, he's reconsidered and is changing the sequence of the strands. A remarkable photograph, a lantern slide from a collection I purchased, showing the 4 cables. So we're on the New York side here. This is the old post office, the Tribune building along Park Row. And then we see this cable has been clamped down, the strands. This one also, but this one you see the strands loose, as you do on the 4th cable. So, and now we're atop the tower. These are the saddles that were designed by Washington Roebling to allow the cables to move back and forth with the temperature. And so he knew that on a hot day, the cables would expand. On a cold day, they would contract, and they wanted to build in the ability for them to move. And so here's another really great 3D image atop the towers. Unfortunately, these saddles completely failed from the weight of the cables. And so they also wrapped the cables. Washington Roebling came up with the idea of using a galvanized zinc to wrap the cables to protect the steel. Here are the approaches. And you can see basically you've got 3 broad sections. One of the beautiful drawings by Wilhelm Hildenbrand, who was certainly the most artistic of the draftsmen. And this shows you just how tight the work space was. Here, they constructed a temporary railroad on wood. And up at the top, you see a railroad car. And this was for the movement of the materials. So here's the approach in 3D. And you should be able to see those boards in the foreground kind of popping as a 3D effect. And here's that railroad car. So it could slide back and forth on these wooden rails. And here it is in operation with a payload. And so they could move the granite to anywhere on the approach where it was needed. Next stone up kind of idea. Here's the suspended superstructure. This is the deck. And so steel extended from each of the towers. And the 5 sections of the bridge. So for carriages and for cattle, etc., then they were going to build cable cars. A promenade, elevated promenade, also unprecedented for leisure, for views. And so here we are building, these are the wires, these are the suspenders that drop down. And to those suspenders are connected the steel beams that created the deck of the bridge. And here we see steel decking also, and the decking as it proceeds into Brooklyn with Old Fulton Street to our right here. So here we are in operation. And here is the railway and terminal. And so they could not use steam locomotives, too heavy. And so they went with cable cars. And this is William Payne, who was a pioneer of cable cars in America. He had built cable cars in San Francisco, in Denver, in Cleveland. And so he pioneered this cable car construction. They had this huge engine on the Brooklyn side. These are the terminals that they built. 5 cents, 5 minutes to go from Brooklyn to New York or New York to Brooklyn. Some of the drawings of the early ironwork here. And you see that same ironwork at the far right. And then the interior as they were working on the Brooklyn terminal, the New York terminal. And a little movie here of the cable cars in operation. And so the photographer here is on the cable cars. And you can see this is where the cable is, this area right here. And you see trolleys here also. So the bridge was in such demand for commuters that they added these trolleys in lanes. And the bridge has evolved over time. And so the trolleys were taken out about 1950 as the car was ascendant, and 3 car lanes in each direction were created. And then, bike lanes. So with the bicycle now ascendant, New York City has taken out, as of September 14th of this year, one of the lanes for cars, and has also moved these bikes off the pedestrian promenade, which is just sensational now, a completely different experience. I went up there in May, and you had to look over your shoulder and at bicycles coming by, and that's no longer the case, and is very much the way it was intended by both John and Washington Roebling. And so the opening was May 24th of 1883, grand fireworks. Chester A. Arthur, President of the United States, was there for the opening. Seth Low, who was the mayor of Brooklyn at the time, greeted him. The North Atlantic Fleet was there firing salutes. And a union of hearts, a union of hands. Oops. And the fireworks. So these fireworks were repeated by the Grucci's in 1983, and I was happy to be there atop the Eagle Warehouse on Old Fulton Street in Brooklyn. So the bridge remains iconic. Advertisements for the Knicks against the Nets show the Brooklyn Bridge, and the Brooklyn Bridge is every bit as beautiful as it was the day that it opened in 1883. And so my book again, and let's just read Montgomery Schuyler was one of the first art critics in America. He is in fact interred at Greenwood Cemetery. And he wrote on the day the bridge opens, "It so happens that the work, which is likely to be our most durable monument and to convey some knowledge of us to the most remote posterity, is a work of bare utility, not a shrine, not a fortress, not a palace, but a bridge." So I think I will stop sharing here, and Elizabeth is back, and then we may have some questions, and I'll be happy to entertain those.
Great. We do have some questions, and I can't resist but start with the one that came in first, which is you mentioned Emily coming across the bridge with a rooster, but you didn't explain why.
Oh, as a symbol of triumph.
Ah, okay. That was our very first question.
Oh, okay.
So
My mistake. I'm sorry.
So there's actually a number of questions sort of about labor, and I'm going to combine them a little bit. There was some question about whether any Mohawk skywalkers, the people who were famous for building skyscrapers in New York, were involved in the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, and also a question of whether there was any loss of life actually during the construction.
Oh, okay. So interesting question about Mohawk workers who were, used on skyscrapers in the 20th century because of their ability to function up high. Not to my knowledge. I don't know about that. In terms of the workers and deaths, the Brooklyn Bridge Company, like the practice in the 19th century, did not keep careful records of who was injured and who died. And so the best estimates we can come up with is somewhere in the range of 20 to 30 of the workers died during the construction. Several of them from the bends. Ultimately, Washington Roebling, when they were digging the Caisson down on the New York side, decided that the bends cases were increasing and that he was just going to stop digging, even though he had not reached bedrock there because of the danger in continuing, because you needed more and more compressed air to keep the water out as you proceeded. And that created a greater and greater danger of the bends.
We also have a question actually about those air shafts in the caissons, and the question was whether there's anything remnant of them that remains today.
Of the caissons?
Of the air shafts that were in the caissons.
Oh, no, those were filled in. So when they reached the level that they wanted it to be at, they then started to either mix concrete up top and bricks and drop them through the supply shafts, or when it was too cold on the Brooklyn side, they dropped the elements in and mixed underneath, and that filled up all of those entrance shafts, solid and solid foundations for the bridge.
Great. We also have a question about whether the wood in the caissons were affected by being in water for as long as they were, and whether there was any rotting that happened, whether that was something that they were fighting off in some way or another.
Yes, very interesting. When they started their prep work on the Brooklyn side, they started pulling those wooden pilings out. And so let's say, for the sake of argument, they were about a foot across. When they reached the area between the tides, the sea worms had eaten them so that they barely existed anymore. But the confidence was that once they got below that level, once they dug the caisson down, those worms weren't going to be a factor. And that's in fact what turned out to be. So if you're in that middle area, they're doing their damage. But once you get past that, not a problem.
There's also a question from Ricky James, who, by the way, actually rode those cable cars at one point in his life. So that's a pretty special memory. But he also asks, how many levels down from the street level do the bridge stanchions actually go into the earth? Approximately how many feet, do you know, from street level?
I think that on the Brooklyn side, I'm thinking like 60 feet the caisson went down. And on the New York side, closer to 90 feet.
Thank you. Thank you. That's wonderful. And let me just see whether there's any other one more question about the sort of longevity of the bridge. Is someone's asking about, with modern surveying technology, whether we know whether the bridge has moved in any way or whether it's sunk in any way.
I think neither. I don't think it's moved, and I don't think it's sunk. I think it's pretty solid. In the 1950 or so, a examination of the bridge was done. And after several years, they concluded that it needed a coat of paint. So I think it's pretty good. It's my understanding now that you could in fact replace the cables, that the technology exists for that if necessary, but I don't know that, and I don't think there has been any deterioration of the cables and certainly not of the granite. I know that the granite was just recently cleaned and, you know, looks great. So hopefully for many, many years to come, the Brooklyn Bridge will be there.
Fortunately, we need to wrap this up, and I really urge anyone who's got other questions for Jeff. I suspect the answers are probably in the book. So we urge you to go shop locally and go buy the book at your local bookstore, or certainly a community books, which has it for sure. So thank you, Jeff. This is really a wonderful talk. The 3D images are fantastic. And I think they're really add such an element to understanding the Brooklyn Bridge and the Brooklyn Bridge construction. It gave me a little vertigo, feeling like I was up there all along. So I'd also like to thank, as we close up, the incredible MAS staff who helped coordinate tonight's event. And thank you all to everyone who was able to join us tonight. A special thanks, especially to MAS members. If you're not a member and enjoyed today's program, we hope that you will consider joining. Your membership helps support MAS programs and advocacy towards a more livable city, making that possible. And right now, you can double your impact. Any donations or membership contributions received between now and December 31st will be matched dollar by dollar by a challenge grant from the MAS Board of Directors up to $50,000. And before we head into 2022, make sure to check out MAS's upcoming tours throughout December. See the chat for more details. MAS wishes you a safe and joyful holiday season, and thank you again, and have a wonderful evening.